Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me talk for a moment about Poland in relation to the U.S. proxy war against Europe, popularly known as the Ukraine war. As I have stated since the outbreak of the war, in my opinion, the Ukraine war is a U.S. proxy war not against Russia, but against Europe. It is the launch pad for a continent-wide destabilization project that will create conflict zone conditions across Europe. It will divide the EU against itself. It will deindustrialize the continent and turn it into another laboratory for the imposition of severe neoliberal austerity policies that will wipe out all except the largest private sector players and basically re-feudalize Europe. Now, Poland appears to have been selected by the United States to act as their hub of operations for implementing this program. But before I get into that, let's go back to one of the earliest examples of this type of project, the dirty wars in Central and South America in the 1980s. When I was growing up, I was always interested in the news and current affairs and world events and so on. And the evening news every night was dominated by stories of savagery in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Argentina. Civil wars, death squads, abductions, torture, and all forms of brutality proliferated the entire region. Now, all of this was orchestrated out of the American embassy in Honduras under the management of then U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte, whom locals referred to as Mr. Death Squad. Honduras had the largest U.S. embassy. It had the biggest CIA station. And the country became the staging ground for a regional destabilization project that continued throughout the 1980s. When John Negroponte was appointed the U.S. ambassador to Iraq shortly after the invasion and occupation, I fully anticipated that he would pursue the same sort of destabilization project throughout the Middle East. Now, Negroponte had a protege named Robert Stephen Ford, who was appointed the U.S. ambassador to Syria at that time, and he immediately began trying to foment rebellion and opposition and resistance and recruiting militia groups until he was eventually kicked out of the country. Now, I think we're all aware of what happened a few short years later in the Arab world with the Arab Spring, and we're all aware also, I think, of the role played by CIA-backed organizations in that disruptive movement. And I think we're also all aware of the role played by the CIA in backing armed groups in the civil war in Syria. In fact, during the Arab Spring, the United States tried to appoint Robert Stephen Ford after he'd been kicked out of Syria. They tried to appoint him as the U.S. ambassador to Egypt, but fortunately, his reputation and the reputation of John Negroponte preceded them, and popular opposition to that appointment forced the U.S. to scrap the idea. So the point here is that there is a pattern, and once you are familiar with the pattern, you can recognize it, and you can sort of abstractly predict the way it's going to play out, if not specifically. Well, in the current scenario, in my opinion, Poland is Honduras. Near the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I noticed the role being played by Poland as a destination for refugees and as a source for mercenaries to go and fight in Ukraine. So I decided to check, who is the U.S. ambassador to Poland right now? Well, the U.S. ambassador to Poland right now is not Robert Stephen Ford, and it's not John Negroponte or any of their known proteges. The current U.S. ambassador to Poland is the son of one of the most notorious policy advisors in recent U.S. history, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I'm not going to make any effort to say his name correctly. Brzezinski, who was Polish, was the architect of U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And he was a staunch and paranoid anti-Russian zealot. Now, Brzezinski felt that the disintegration of the EU was inevitable, and that only the perception of a threat being posed by Russia could possibly induce the Europeans to act in unison.
I think a united Europe came into being out of fear. I think that entity is now on the way to a disintegration because the fear is gone. There is a certain inevitability to that. Now, if Putin starts another wave of Cold War unilateral actions, they'll probably all come back again.
He also believed that there were several countries that had been admitted into the EU that never should have been admitted, namely the Eastern Bloc countries and the Baltic states. Now, I think it's safe to assume that Mark Brzezinski, the current U.S. ambassador to Poland, probably shares his father's views, and he is now in charge of coordinating the destabilization program for Europe that will see the continent split right down the middle, with America's focus of support moving from the Atlantic European states and the Central European states to the Eastern European states, with Poland as its primary client. Ironically, the US is using Brzezinski's theory that the Europeans need a Russian threat in order to act in unison. They're using that theory to coerce the European nations to be unified in the adoption of policies that will ultimately lead to the disintegration of Europe. Now, no doubt, the US is dangling promises in front of Poland, telling them that they will re-emerge as a major power after 4 centuries of irrelevance, telling them that Germany is weakening, both naturally and by design, and that Poland can become not only the manufacturing hub and heart of Europe, but also the strongest military power. They're even hinting that Poland can become a superstate, incorporating both Lithuania and Western Ukraine into their territory. And just FYI, the suspected St. Petersburg bomber was born in Western Ukraine. So based on all of these promises, in my opinion, Poland is willingly doing America's dirty work, which, after all, they've actually been doing for quite some time. As a result of embracing their role as a destabilizing client state of the US, Poland will likely become a police state, and this is already happening, with American soldiers running amok in the country and Polish police telling their citizens that they have no right to arrest them, as you see here.
You could post this on any social media. You think Russia's going to protect you?
And the same is likely to happen in the other Eastern Bloc and Baltic states where America is shifting its focus. They will be tightly controlled by American influence, and they will be encouraged to distance themselves from the EU and to even form their own economic and security bloc, which again, we already see happening. Poland will potentially become militarily engaged in the war in Ukraine against Russia, as well as potentially in Belarus. And unquestionably, covert disruption activities in both Moldova and in Georgia and elsewhere will be originating from the US Embassy in Warsaw. So this is just to give you a sort of geopolitical framework for what's happening in Europe and Poland's role in that, in what is a repeating pattern by the US. And here I would like to say that I think our understanding of the multiple ayat in the Quran that warn the Muslims against taking the kuffar as our awliya, our understanding should include the possibility that this isn't only because they are unreliable awliya for the Muslims, but also because they are unreliable awliya even for each other. And this is because they tend to operate according to short-sighted self-interest. Their loyalty is a commodity sold for benefit, and they will willingly turn on anyone if they think it will profit them. I don't think anything could demonstrate this more clearly than what's going on in Europe, and how America has no qualms whatsoever about sabotaging and undermining the safety, the prosperity, and even the lives of Europeans, while at the same time claiming to be their best friends. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.